October 4th, 2022. I don't understand why he wanted me to change. I always felt beautiful the way I was. Edit. People keep asking if it's me in that Polaroid. No. This was Richard's ex. He wanted me to look like her. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag instagood. Hashtag instamood. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag love. Hashtag smile. Hashtag beautiful. Hashtag pretty. Hashtag happy. Hashtag photo of the day. Hashtag photo. Hashtag photographer. Hashtag photography. October 13th, 2022. I went walking today, and noticed that despite being here for a little while, the cold air gives me a flash memory of what it felt like entering this world. It was like entering through a doorway made of a beautiful, all-knowing light. The contrast was fascinating because there was also a blackness in this light that felt never-ending. Almost like a black tunnel that stretched to the ends of the universe. Halfway through the door, its shape went from a rectangle to a circle with that familiar cold blackness in the middle and with that same familiar light around it. It felt like what your species would describe life and death to be like. And despite it only taking a second for me to step foot from my world to yours, it felt as if my body was shot through a cannon moving millions of miles. It felt as though I was traveling around the universe. I felt a cold cosmic wind go through my own being, which caused me a great deal of excitement. The autumn air reminds me of that feeling. This time of year is bittersweet for me. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag happy. Hashtag smile. Hashtag FYP. Hashtag selfie. Hashtag beautiful. Hashtag pretty. Hashtag instagood. Hashtag insta. Hashtag instadaily. Hashtag instamood. Hashtag photo of the day. Hashtag photo. Hashtag photographer. Hashtag photography. Hashtag photoshoot. Hashtag fall. Hashtag fall aesthetic. October 19th, 2022. The best part about October is that people give me candy for some reason. They always say nice costume, or you really went all out this year. Last night, I scored an entire pail worth of treats. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag October. Hashtag Halloween. Hashtag Halloween costume. Hashtag makeup. Hashtag beautiful. Hashtag pretty. Hashtag smile. Hashtag love. Hashtag photo of the day. Hashtag photo. Hashtag photographer. Hashtag photography. Hashtag happy. Hashtag candy. October 26th, 2022. Your traditions of carving produce to signify a spooky season intrigues me. Here's one I made. When I first came here, Richard never let me carve a pumpkin. I missed out on so much at first. Hashtag pumpkin. Hashtag pumpkin carving. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag spooky season. Hashtag love. Hashtag happy. Hashtag photo of the day. Hashtag photo. Hashtag photographer. Hashtag photography. Hashtag Halloween. Hashtag explore page. November 3rd, 2022. It has come to my attention that my brother has been causing some problems for the human species. I was anonymously sent this photograph from someone who claims this was taken from their brother's phone, who is now missing. I had mentioned this before, and will again, clearer. If you hear the name Vinyl Targas in your dreams, do not embrace it. Please. Run from it. And do not say his name out loud. There is a chance he will answer your call. So please, just ignore him. I'm so sorry for all of this. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag smile. Hashtag love. Hashtag photo of the day. Hashtag photo. Hashtag photographer. Hashtag photographer. Hashtag photoshoot. Hashtag instagood. Hashtag Insta. Hashtag Insta Daily. Hashtag Insta Mood. Hashtag Instagram. November 15, 2022. Apologies for taking a week off. I realized my brother had done a lot of damage here. I'm disappointed in him. I tried to tell him to be kind, but he is evil. No care for anything. Just his own sick pleasures. I hate to do this, but I must remove him. I am no longer playing games. Wherever he is, I will find him, and I have help. I will update you all very soon. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag Insta good. Hashtag Insta. Hashtag Insta Daily. Hashtag Insta Mood. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag Photo of the Day. Hashtag Photo. Hashtag Photographer. Hashtag Photography. Hashtag Smile. Hashtag Love. Hashtag Happy. November 24, 2022. After finding my brother and taking care of him, I can now relax with my friends and their cat, who happens to be a sibling of mine, Peanut. He helped prepare dinner for today. It looks wonderful. Thank you, Peanut. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag love. Hashtag Insta good. Hashtag Insta. Hashtag Insta Daily. Hashtag Insta Mood. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag Photo of the Day. Hashtag Photo. Hashtag Photographer. Hashtag Photography. Hashtag Photo Shoot. Hashtag Happy Thanksgiving. Hashtag Thanksgiving. Hashtag Family. Hashtag Food. December 7, 2022. I decided to show him my more natural face. Sadly, I get messages like this a lot. Reminds me of another sad little human from a couple years ago. Hashtag hello. Hashtag Insta good. Hashtag Insta. Hashtag Insta Daily. Hashtag Insta Mood. Hashtag Insta Food. Hashtag Loser. Hashtag Love. Hashtag Photo of the Day. Hashtag Photo. Hashtag Photographer. Hashtag Photography. Hashtag Photo Shoot. Hashtag Happy. Hashtag Hi. December 9, 2022. Sent by a fan. An oil painting of me, myself. It makes my eyes water with happiness when fans make art of me. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag happy. Hashtag art. Hashtag artwork. Hashtag artists on Instagram. Hashtag artist. Hashtag art gallery. Hashtag art of the day. Hashtag photo of the day. Hashtag photo. Hashtag photographer. Hashtag photography. Hashtag photo shoot. Hashtag oil painting. Hashtag oil paintings. Hashtag oil. Hashtag painting. Hashtag paint. Hashtag paintings. December 14, 2022. It is the holiday, a difficult time filled with a mix of nostalgia and sadness. A bittersweet feeling. Richard was my first human friend, but I accept that it wasn't meant to be. He made his choice, and I made mine. Sadly, despite the pain of our friendship decayed, I can't even celebrate now because I see the pain this world is in. Especially in other countries. I wish you all could just love one another, and live your lives, helping others love themselves for who they are, and not helping them to fit your standards so you can love them. This world is rotting, and I hope those of you under the thumb of bigger people with smaller hearts stay strong. One day you will be the lifeblood that makes this earth a beautiful place to live in. Hashtag InstaGood. Hashtag Insta. Hashtag Insta Daily. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag InstaLove. Hashtag love. Hashtag I love you. Hashtag love yourself. Hashtag stay strong. Hashtag photo of the day. Hashtag photo. Hashtag photographer. Hashtag photography. Hashtag Christmas decor. Hashtag Christmas. Hashtag Christmas tree. Hashtag Merry Christmas. Hashtag Happy Holidays. December 25th, 2022. Wow. Thank you all for the milestone. What a wonderful Christmas gift. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag Insta good. Hashtag Insta. Hashtag Insta food. Hashtag Insta love. Hashtag Insta daily. Hashtag Insta mood. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag love. Hashtag love yourself. Hashtag Merry Christmas. Hashtag Christmas. Hashtag Happy Holidays. Hashtag photo of the day. Hashtag photo. Hashtag photographer. Hashtag photography. December 30th, 2022. A rant. I apologize for being absent during my 500 follower celebration. I was being chased by some people who claimed to be higher up. I hid in a mall. They never found me. Ha 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 ha. They wanted to take me away for dealing with some billionaire who apparently has some level of importance to this planet, though I don't know what that is. He used forbidden knowledge to make more money with his wife and snot-nosed son. I was just making things right. The main reason I did it was because he used this technology to put more money in his fat pockets, and more food in his fat belly, not to help others in need, while there are people out there digging in their pockets for enough change to buy a loaf of bread and juice for their kids. During the holiday season, I have learned that in this world, I do not hate the common man, but hate the man who lacks the common knowledge and care for the very world their feet tread. I'm not perfect. I shouldn't have taken people to my planet to be tested on, but I'm growing. I'm learning from my mistakes. I am trying to be good to this world. Why can't they? Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag Insta good. Hashtag Insta. Hashtag Insta food. Hashtag Insta love. Hashtag Insta daily. Hashtag Insta mood. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag photo of the day. Hashtag photo. Hashtag photographer. Hashtag photography. Hashtag photo shoot. Hashtag mall. Hashtag AESTHETIC. Hashtag love. Hashtag love yourself. Hashtag I hate billionaires. Hashtag hungry. January 1st, 2023. Happy New Year, my wonderful friends and family. Time to eat. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag love. Hashtag love yourself. Hashtag hungry. Hashtag hunger. Hashtag Happy New Year. Hashtag photo of the day. Hashtag photo. Hashtag photographer. Hashtag photography. Hashtag photo shoot. Hashtag Insta good. Hashtag Insta. Hashtag Insta food. Hashtag Insta love. Hashtag Insta daily. Hashtag Insta daily. February 7th, 2023. I am very sorry for taking a month off from this social interaction platform. A good friend of mine was taken from me. I've spent the past 30 days in one of my favorite nightclubs. All I feel right now is anger and sadness. I will make things right. To my dear friend, John. I'm sorry I wasn't there for you. I'm sorry I wasn't a good friend all of the time. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag Insta good. Hashtag Insta. Hashtag Insta food. Hashtag Insta love. Hashtag Insta daily. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag sad. Hashtag crying. Hashtag hungry. Hashtag friends. Hashtag love.